Well, good morning again. Happy Palm Sunday to everybody. We have this thing that we do here in the life of the church where, since we started having a preschool about 6 years ago here at the school, or at the church, the preschool has a weekly chapel service. And we alternate members of the staff who will participate in the chapel service with the kids. And so it's very, very predictable, routine kind of format. We gather in here in the worship center, usually in the back of the room, seated on the floor. All the kids come in. We may light a little battery-operated candle. We sing a few songs like Jesus Loves Me, open with a prayer. And then we have a children's Bible that we keep on the shelf in the conference room. And it's more than a cardboard book. Like it's got more stories in it than just a 10 or 12-page book. But it's still an abbreviated Bible. It's Bible highlights, big on pictures, small on text, okay? So we share a story in the Bible, and sometimes we just take a Post-it note, put it in the page, and then we know where to pick up the next week when it's time for chapel again. Last year on this week, on Holy Week, it was Andrew's turn. And Andrew went in and did the lesson that day, and he thought that he would read the story of Holy Week. Wanted to read the story of Good Friday. After all, that was the week that we were in. It was time to share that part of the story. And Andrew came into our staff meeting after chapel that morning with sort of a puzzled look on his face. And he said, "Do you know that our children's Bible doesn't have Good Friday in it?" So what do you mean? Like somebody tore it out? No. It's just purposefully left out. It goes from Palm Sunday and the Palm Procession in Jerusalem to Easter Sunday. And we just sort of cut out the difficult stuff at the end of the week. Now look, I'm not one to say, let's sit our children down to watch Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. That is not what I'm advocating, but I feel like there's maybe some sort of middle ground between just cutting ahead to Easter and sort of the gore fest that we could allow ourselves to get into. And I get it. Look, I mean, some people are really moved by those kinds of depictions, and that is our preferred medium these days for telling the story. I get that. But I also think we can't sanitize and whitewash things so much that we leave the crucifixion and the Last Supper out of children's Bibles. And there's a tendency, I think, that for all of us that we want to do the same thing. I mean, many of us don't look forward to Holy Week because we are eager to dive in and immerse ourselves in a story that makes us feel uncomfortable. And it's not about going overboard, and it's not about making us feel terrible guilt or shame, but it is saying, look, if we just leave that page out of the Bible, we're going to be missing something significant. And so what I want to do today is I want to tell you a little bit more about the Palm Sunday story. Now, there's a number of theories out there about what happened exactly that day. Sure, we have our gospel accounts that we can read the story of Jesus, what we call his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And there's a lot of interesting ideas out there about what exactly that represented. Clearly, we've sung about much of that this morning. A king who comes in and sort of ushers in an upside-down kingdom like we talked about last week. A king whose coronation will come to fruition with the crown of thorns placed on his head. Instead of bowing at the throne, we will be watching him as he is elevated onto the cross instead of onto a golden throne. That kind of thing. We talked about Jesus' way of doing things and that it's a little bit sometimes a surprising way of doing things. And even a couple of years ago, you may remember I shared one theory about how Pontius Pilate came in with his own procession, which was sort of a power of military prowess kind of way of processing into the city. And Jesus comes at it from a different side of the city in a super humble way and maybe in a parody of what the might of Rome was doing. But I want to talk about an even a different idea about what may have taken place. And I heard this just a few months ago for the very first time. And some of you may be familiar with this. Bear with me if this is not new to you. but I want to give you a different perspective on Palm Sunday. And in order to do that, we're going to have to go back a long time, even well before Palm Sunday. You know that when we read stories of Jesus, what we can't forget when we are reading them is Jesus' Jewishness. I mean, he was a Jewish man, raised in a Jewish culture, in a Jewish pocket of the planet, at a time when Judaism was really thriving pretty well, despite being under the intense scrutiny and persecution of the Roman Empire. And if we go back to the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, the book begins, you may remember, with a baby Moses. Moses is born in Egypt. He is a Hebrew baby. He's a Jewish baby boy, but his life is spared because of some trickery on the part of his mom and his sister, and he ends up being raised by the Pharaoh's daughter. So he's Jewish, but he's kind of Egyptian at the same time. And then as he moves into adulthood, he leaves, and we don't need to tell that whole story, but he leaves the land of Egypt for a while, and then God calls him to come back. And he says, I have a special purpose for you. You are going back to Egypt, and you are going to free my people, the Hebrew people, from slavery. They are being mistreated. They are being persecuted. I'm worried about their identity. They need to be rescued and delivered from the hand of Pharaoh. So Moses goes in and he asks Pharaoh, hey, God says you should let the people go. And Pharaoh says, nice try. And then there's these series of plagues. You may remember the story, 9 different plagues. And every time, Pharaoh's heart is so hard that he refuses to release the people. And then finally, God says, all right, I didn't want to do this, but this is what's going to happen. My angel of death, called the Destroyer, will pass over all of the Egyptian houses and kill all firstborn children. And I don't want to do this, but that will get Pharaoh's attention. And here's what I want you to tell my people to do, Moses. The night when that's about to happen, I want you to ask each one of the families to take a 1-year-old lamb, blemish-free, so I want the best of the flock, and I want those people to kill the lamb. I want them to take the blood of that lamb, and I want them to smear it across their doorpost as a sign that a Hebrew family lives there. Then I want you to tell the people to prepare a meal out of that lamb, and anything that remains over after they have feasted on it, I want it to be consumed by flame and reduced to dust. That night, the Destroyer moves over across Egypt, killing all the firstborns, but passing over all of the Hebrew family homes. They quickly gather their belongings. They don't have time to watch their bread rise, so they grab their unleavened bread and they head out. And they begin what becomes the 40-year process of going into the wilderness and waiting for God to tell them when it's time to enter into the land that they have been promised for their own. The first year after that event happened, the passing over of the Destroyer, God said, here's what I want you to do. This is going to be a critical piece of our people's story and our identity. And I want you to have a worship service where you tell this story. And I want you to have a lamb available, again, for each household, if at all possible. And I want that lamb to be sacrificed. And when that burnt offering, the fragrance reaches heaven, I will forgive the people for all of the sins that they have committed. We will be restored into right relationship again. And we will continue to repeat this process over and over again so that they might know that I am the God who delivered them, that they are my people, that I have made this covenant with them, and though they will be prone to sinning, as we are, again and again and again, that lamb, every year that they sacrifice, will cover them for their sins as a sacrifice to me. All right, let's fast forward now almost 1,500 years to the time of Jesus. The Jewish people, as they are now known, have been celebrating the Passover event every single year. This is a part of their practice. This is what they do. If you have Jewish friends, neighbors, family, they have celebrated the Passover this weekend, as a matter of fact. And so the Passover event is taking place every single year. But in addition to just having that meal, telling that story about God's faithfulness and deliverance and sacrificing a lamb every year, now there is a built-in pilgrimage that accompanies that. For Jews that are able to do so, they must travel, sometimes for days, to get to Jerusalem, to get to the holy city, because that, after all, is where the temple is. And the temple is where God resides. And if you can bring your unblemished lamb to the temple to be sacrificed, then that's even better than doing that in a faraway land. And so families would do that. If they had the means, if they had livestock, if they were people that lived raising animals for a living, they were able to do that, and they would bring them into the city with them. But then there were all the city dwellers and the people who made their living by not raising livestock, and so they would need to purchase lambs. And so lambs would be available in marketplaces for them, as would other animals, like doves and so forth. So when Jesus goes into the marketplace and turns the tables, remember that story? There's a marketplace, there's a whole economy around honoring God, providing these sacrifices, and so forth. And so that's what's happening. That's the world and the times in which Jesus is living. This is sort of big business, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It was just how it was. The challenge is that without trains and trucks and other ways to bring the livestock into the city, it would be difficult to do that. And so it wasn't practical for most people to sort of bring their sheep with them on multi-day journeys into the city. And so what happened was there was a cottage industry that started to establish itself just outside of the walls of Jerusalem, where there were sheep that were raised specifically with the purpose of being raised for 1 year so that they could be sacrificed at the Passover celebration each spring. The most common place that the sheep would come from, or that these lambs would come from, was an area that even way back before the time of Jesus was known as prime grazing land. You may remember the story of Esther. She was from the land of Moab, which was across the Jordan River. But when she came with her mother-in-law, Naomi, they went back to an area just outside of Jerusalem called Bethlehem. And Bethlehem had land that a kinsman, Boaz, owned as his own land. And Ruth and Naomi were able to glean or pick up all of the leftover crops that the harvesters didn't catch the first time they passed through. And this land was also really well known for shepherding. In fact, in the Christmas story, you may remember that the shepherds in Bethlehem received news because Jesus was born right down the road, or well, probably just right up the hillside from where they were. So shepherding was big business in Bethlehem. And it had the extra benefit of being something that people equated with, well, Bethlehem is the birthplace of King David. So that's the city of David, and he's our most beloved king. And we know that the Messiah will come out of the lineage or the line of David because that's what the prophets foretold. So it's even more special if we get a sheep that has been alive for 1 year, that is blemish-free, that is from Bethlehem, and can be brought into the city for the Passover, for the sacrifice. But I told you that this is big business. With all of the people who are making their pilgrimage into Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, that was maybe around 25-ish thousand people at the time of Jesus, not a huge city, the city would sometimes quintuple in size. In fact, the Jewish historian Josephus noted that at one Passover celebration, he counted 265,000 sheep that were brought in for sacrificing. 250,000 sheep. Which means that every day during the Passover celebration, At 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., it was constantly sacrificing sheep, one after the other, because family after family after family after family did this. They told their story. They received their forgiveness of sins. This is how it happened. And one sheep every year, the most perfect of all of the sheep that was brought in, was designated as the Paschal lamb. And that sheep would be brought to the high priest, the Jewish high priest, and he would say, that one is the best one. And on the last day of sacrifices, at 3 p.m., the final sheep would be offered up for sacrifice, the final, most perfect lamb. The sheep that came in, or the lambs, probably more accurately, the lambs that came in from Bethlehem for Jerusalem would have come in probably all at once. These were sheep that were raised for this purpose, and there was sort of, I guess, a cattle drive is the best thing I can think of for sheep. And they were brought in from this first-ring suburb community called Bethlehem of Jerusalem. And they came in. And people would line the roads to celebrate the coming in of all the lambs into Jerusalem. And as the crowd watched and pointed out their favorites, the most perfect ones, maybe the ones that they'd try to go back and buy, but they made their way from the city gate to the high priest, where he selected the most perfect lamb. The telling of the story that I heard this year is that on that Sunday, Jesus came in riding in on a colt at the back end of that ushering in of the lambs. He came in to the procession that was already there. Have you ever read the Palm Sunday story and wondered why there were people already there? What do you mean there's a crowd already gathered and they've got cloaks that they're taking off and they're waving palm branches? It's like, is this spontaneous? Has Jesus' fame and notoriety been so widespread that there's already people planning for his arrival and are just waiting for the moment and they're at the right gate, at the right time, on the right day? Maybe. But it would also make sense that if there was a procession that came in from the direction of Bethlehem, and Jesus came in from Bethany, that he might pop in on the tail end of all of those sheep entering. And all of a sudden now, this one who's being lifted up as the King, the Messiah, the one that people had been waiting on, yes, he's coming in humbly. Yes, this is not like a king. Yes, this is not like a mighty warrior or a general in the army. And this is not the person, at least by appearance, who is going to save them from the oppression of the Roman Empire. But I don't think the symbolism would have been lost on them as it probably is on us until we realize that he entered into the back of the sheep procession. And that day, as the crowd welcomed him in and waved the palm fronds, who knows, maybe to just continue to skirt the sheep along through the city streets, I don't know. But they waved their branches and they laid down their cloaks, and I think to the astute observer, they realized what was going on. And Jesus wouldn't make his way to the high priest that day, but he would by Friday. And as he stood blameless before the high priest, he was condemned. And we teach that the sins of the world were placed on the unblemished Lamb of God to be the ultimate sacrifice. And Jesus gathered with his disciples in the upper room, and they broke bread and celebrated the Passover dinner. And then at 3:00 in the afternoon is when we are told that Jesus breathes his last, being sacrificed as the Paschal Lamb of the Passover celebration. These are parts of the story that we can't just jump over. If we tear out a page of our Bible or just skip over it or wish that Holy Week would go away so we could get to the good stuff next Sunday, we're going to miss some of these details that make the story richer, but also make them more meaningful for us. When I heard that, it was like all of these little details and all of these sort of loose threads in the story seemed to come together for me in a way that I'm not sure if that's exactly how it happened, but it sure makes a lot of details make more sense. And what I'd like us to do now is, as we shift or transition in our service today, to be less about the waving of the palm branches and hooray, 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 but instead thinking about what would happen if we were cheering for the sheep that were representing that which would die so that we could be forgiven, and it translated into a human being instead. It raises the stakes a lot. And this is what Jesus willingly did for us. It also makes things make more sense too, like when Paul in his letter to the Corinthians says in the 5th chapter, "For our Paschal Lamb, Christ, has been sacrificed." For our Paschal Lamb, Christ, has been sacrificed. This sermon is to help us enter more richly, deeply into the story. But I also hope it's an invitation. Don't let this week be like all the others. Immerse yourself in these stories. Think about the rich symbolism and what took place. Remember the sacrifice of Christ and how he comes in a long, long story of which we have the blessing of being a part of. And may each of us have a deeply meaningful Holy Week, so that whatever transpires in the days ahead, we may come together in this place a week from now, transformed by the story, renewed in grace, forgiven in love, and given hope for what lies ahead. Let us pray.